अस्सलाम वालेकुम पाकिस्तान और दुनिया में सारे सुनने वालों को अस्सलाम वालेकुम। मैंने हाल ही में बेन नॉर्टन का इंटरव्यू किया। बेन नॉर्टन एक बहुत ही अजीम जर्नलिस्ट हैं और दुनिया में अमेरिकन फॉरेन पॉलिसी के असरात जो दुनिया में है उसके ऊपर इंडिपेंडेंट रिपोर्टिंग करने में उनका एक बहुत बड़ा मकाम है। दुनिया में समझा जाता है, फॉरमोस्ट जर्नलिस्ट समझा जाता है इस मौजू पर। बेन जो है वो फाउंडर हैं, एडिटर हैं एक इंडिपेंडेंट न्यूज़ चैनल के वेबसाइट का जिसका नाम है मल्टा पोलारिस्टा। आप उसको ज़रूर देखिएगा, डिस्क्रिप्शन में मैं उसकी लिंक डाल दूंगा, जहाँ पर वो अंग्रेज़ी में और स्पेनिश में रिपोर्टिंग करते हैं। और उन्होंने इसी आपका जो मौजू है अमेरिकन फॉरेन पॉलिसी और उसका दुनिया में असर क्या है वो एक्सटेंसिवली रिपोर्ट करते हैं, ख़ास तौर पे जो अमेरिकन पॉलिसीज़ का इम्पैक्ट हुआ है साउथ अमेरिका में, मिडल ईस्ट में और अब एशिया में। वो जितने बड़े बड़े मारूफ मीडिया प्लेटफॉर्म्स में उन पर वो आए हुए हैं, उनको फीचर किया गया, जैसे कि स्काई न्यूज़, अल जज़ीरा, डेमोक्रेसी नाउ, एल फ्रांसियारो स्पेनिश का है, ब्लूमबर्ग, अल मायादीन, आरटी, आईआरटी, वर्ल्ड, CGTN न्यूज़, प्रेस टीवी और इस तरह के और बहुत मीडिया हाउसेस। और वो मेक्सिको, निकारागुआ, वेनेजुएला, इक्वाडोर और बोलिविया में भी बहुत एक्सटेंसिवली टीवी पर आते हैं। मैंने उनसे जो बात की, ख़ास तौर पर वो पाकिस्तान की रिजीम चेंज की ऑपरेशन की बात की, जिसके मुतालिक उनके पास बहुत डिटेल्ड इंसाइट है। ऐसे लग रहा था कि मैं किसी पाकिस्तानी एनालिस्ट के साथ बात कर रहा हूँ और कि ये इमरान खान की जो हुकूमत है इसको कैसे निकाला गया एक सॉफ्ट कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल कू से, जनरल बाजवा की मदद से, अमेरिका की कॉन्स्पिरेसी के साथ मिलकर, और एक इंतहाई करप्ट टोला लाके पाकिस्तान के ऊपर मुसल्लत कर दिया गया है कि वो अमेरिका की जो इंटरेस्ट है उनकी पॉलिसीज़ का ख्याल रखें। तो सुनिएगा बेन नॉर्टन से मेरी कॉन्वर्सेशन। So back to you, Ben. Sorry for this Urdu interruption. I was just telling them we're seeking insights from you on how about America and how to seek this. So Ben, tell us. We've been experiencing American control over Pakistan for most of our existence in 1975. America's been very prominently supporting our military regimes, military dictators. It has never, ever supported a genuine social reformer. And very recently in April, as you know, we've had a regime change in Pakistan where all the fingerprints and footprints points to a very strong American intervention through the Pakistan Army military to overthrow in a soft coup, garbed as a constitutional vote of no confidence. Tell us something about what you know about this.
Well, this is not unique, unfortunately, just to Pakistan. We've seen that the United States has carried out many similar regime change operations around the world. We should call it what it is. It's a coup. You called it a soft coup. That's a great term. You can also call it a political coup or a judicial coup. It's actually very similar to a similar coup that happened in Brazil in 2016 and 2018. And that was when the Workers' Party, a left-wing government in Brazil, was overthrown through an impeachment proceeding that's very similar to the vote of no confidence in Imran Khan in the parliament. Basically the same playbook. And that removed Brazil's elected president, Dilma Rousseff, and installed an unelected, corrupt, right-wing government that was just a tool of the US. So it's very similar to what we've seen with Shahbaz Sharif, who's completely unelected. He's so corrupt that he was being investigated for corruption before he was installed as the unelected leader. And then, of course, in Brazil, there was the second part of the coup in 2018, in which there were elections, but the main popular left-wing candidate, Lula da Silva, was imprisoned on fake charges. It's actually quite similar to what's also happening right now in Argentina, with a similar case where a very corrupt right-wing justice system is trying to imprison the very popular left-wing vice president, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who was also former president like Lula da Silva, and is trying to prevent her from being presidential candidate. So this is something in Latin America that people are familiar with, what happened in Pakistan. And that's why when Imran Khan, who was, of course, democratically elected, unlike Shahbaz Sharif, when he talked about the role of the U.S. in backing this operation, this regime change, it wasn't very surprising to a lot of people in the global South, especially here in Latin America. And we saw, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, Donald Lu, he admitted it. in a congressional hearing, he said that the US was pressuring Pakistan specifically over its relations with Russia. And that's a major factor. And it's not a coincidence now that after the coup, we've seen that General Bajwa, the head of the Army Chief of Staff in Pakistan, he just took a trip to Britain and the United States, pledging support. And we see reports that now Pakistan is selling ammunition to Ukraine, which makes it a party to this proxy war going on in Ukraine against Russia. And we also saw that General Bajwa himself, he condemned Russia immediately after the coup, when Imran Khan had been maintaining a policy of neutrality. Like many countries in the global south, they don't want to be involved in this Western proxy war. They want to do what's best for their own country. And we've seen that Pakistan, since the coup, has surrendered its own national interests and has instead been acting on what's good for the US and not for the Pakistani people.
So this is so interesting, Ben. I mean, hearing you speak, I think I'm hearing a Pakistani like myself talking about the issues. How are you so well informed, and how are the large majority of opinion makers and policy makers in America so uninformed?
Well, because the reality is that the so-called opinion makers in the US, they're put in those positions because they are pushing a particular political line that's in the interests of imperialism. I mean, we've seen again and again that any journalists in mainstream institutions who challenge war, who challenge empire, are pushed out. One of the most famous examples is Chris Hedges, right? He was an award-winning New York Times journalist, and then he opposed the Iraq War, and he was pushed out of the New York Times. And that's why we see again and again throughout modern US history, there are all these wars that are extremely unpopular. The war in Iraq, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, the war in Yemen, the war in Afghanistan that just ended after 20 years. If you look at popular opinion, these wars are very unpopular. But if you look at the media, there are almost no voices challenging these wars because these large corporate media institutions, one, they're corporate media, so they exist to make money. And the billionaire oligarchs who own these media outlets, like, for instance, Jeff Bezos, the chairman of Amazon, who owns the Washington Post, they have a vested interest in not rocking the boat, in supporting the US government, because they have billions of dollars of contracts with the US government. Amazon has billions of dollars of contracts with the CIA and with the Pentagon. And that's true for other big Silicon Valley corporations. So these big media companies, they don't want to, they don't want to have problems with the US government because they make money off of the US government and its foreign policy. And then furthermore, there's also internally, I say this as a journalist who has experience working in newsrooms, there's an internal culture where people who are friendly to the line of the Pentagon and the CIA, who support these wars and these, regime change operations, they're promoted. If you as a journalist, you build these alliances inside the CIA, inside the Pentagon, they give you stories. So the New York Times and the Washington Post, all of their stories basically are based on leaks that are sent to them from people in the CIA or from the Pentagon. They often refer to them as anonymous officials, senior level CIA officials or something like that. So if you are very obedient and you don't bite the hand that feeds you, you get fed many of these stories and you can work your way up the chain and become an award-winning reporter at the New York Times or the Washington Post. And then that media, of course, is what determines what most people think, because the media, not just the news media, the print media, but especially the TV media, which is even more biased. We see that is largely what determines popular opinion. And anyone who even mildly goes against that, like Bernie Sanders, for instance, even though Bernie Sanders around much of the world would be seen as a very, moderate candidate, especially in parts of Latin America and Europe and parts of Asia, what he was calling for is not that radical. But in the context of the US, he's seen as this crazy radical figure. And he's completely marginalized and attacked by the media. So unfortunately, the reality is that the media is so tightly controlled. 5 corporations control over 90% of the news media in the United States.
This brings me to that major problem that people like us in Pakistan have to deal with is, are we going to suffer forever this massive coalition of the media, the defense industry, the Congress, the policymakers, which form what is the U.S. government, and not or be subjected to immense pressure, sanctions, like the Latin American countries you've mentioned, like Iran, like Cuba. What's the alternative? I mean, what do we do?
Well, we already see the alternative being constructed. We're seeing the end of this unipolar world in which the United States dominated the entire world. We saw that since 1991 with the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And what that meant is the United States declared full spectrum dominance, as the Pentagon said. They also published this thing called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, in which the United States said that its goal is to be the dominant power in every region of the world and to prevent a near peer strategic competitor. Of course, the situation is very different now. China has the largest economy in the world, according to purchasing power parity measurement, which is much better than just GDP in dollars. Russia is on the rise again after being just devastated in the 1990s. And we also see the rise of countries across Asia. I mean, people talk about India, but Pakistan actually is also a significant part of this, the rise of these large Asian powers. These countries did formally obtain independence from colonialism, but as Nkrumah said, the famous Ghanaian leader who was like the founding father of the modern government of Ghana, as he famously said, the reality is that these countries were victims of neocolonialism, because although they got political independence, they never got economic independence from the Western colonial powers. So we've seen a long process of moving back toward that period of independence. And I would say now more and more we see, with the decline of Western hegemony and the rise of a new multipolar world, we see more opportunities. And in the case of Pakistan, I think they're actually, in the short term, it looks pessimistic, but I think they're in the long term, the medium and the long term, there are a lot of opportunities for Pakistan. Of course, Pakistan has become a major partner of China, which is the fastest growing economic power. With the China-Pakistan economic corridor, we see that there are a lot of opportunities to help develop infrastructure in Pakistan. There are also opportunities being offered to get out of the control of the IMF. All Pakistanis know that the International Monetary Fund has just controlled the economy in Pakistan for many decades and has forced the government to impose these austerity measures, to cut oil and gas subsidies, to cut social programs. One of the reasons for the coup against Imran Khan was not only because of his independent foreign policy, not only because he was trying to improve relations with Russia, not only because he called for the end of Western sanctions on Iran, not only because he strongly supported Palestine, which is, of course, a key part of this. We see now that the coup regime is inching toward trying to normalize relations with apartheid Israel, which is, a horrible, act of criminality against the Palestinian people who are occupied and oppressed. So those are all significant factors. But another factor is simply that Imran Khan was trying to pursue a new economic path of what he talked about, an Islamic welfare state, which is anathema to these neoliberal economic policies that the IMF and the World Bank have imposed on the world for decades.
What does the U.S. hope to achieve through this mafia-like bashing of the globe, other than get some really great delight in being the world's greatest superpower, we're the toughest kid on the block, and economic benefits? Is there anything else that just drives this madness?
Well, it's economic. It's being driven by economics. We've seen that really the U.S. and also the European economies have for centuries been based on the pillage of resources in the global South. Let's not forget that the United States was founded on genocide of indigenous nations. The entire way that the United States and Canada were founded was based on stealing resources and land from indigenous peoples, kicking them off their land, and then declaring that land now belongs to you. And so that was theft. And then, of course, the European colonialists did exactly the same thing. The British went to many parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America. The French did the same. Yeah, exactly. And they said, these resources belong to us. You belong to us. Of course, the Indian subcontinent, South Asia, was all basically colonized by Britain. And we saw that what did Britain do? It didn't develop the South Asia. Instead, it extracted resources. We see that the Patnaiks, who are Indian economists, Utsa Patnaik and Prabha Patnaik, have estimated that in a conservative estimate, the British Empire siphoned out $45 trillion of wealth from South Asia. So that would include, of course, modern day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. They siphoned out 45 trillion with the T. The Potnikes have done brilliant research on all of this, on the effects of British colonialism. And the point that they stress is that we're not only talking about extraction of wealth, but that wealth that was extracted from colonialism was then used to develop. So it's not only just extraction, it's a double dipping process, because the Western colonialist powers then used that to fund the creation of railroads and fund the creation of infrastructure. So quite literally, Western powers developed their countries based on stealing the wealth of the global South through colonialism. And although, as I said, formal colonialism technically ended in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that process is still continued through neocolonialism and imperialism. And we see, I mentioned the IMF and the World Bank have continued extracting wealth. So for instance, Sri Lanka right now is going through its 16th IMF program. 16. Clearly the 15 times before it didn't work. So why do people expect it's going to work now the 16th time? And, there's been this attempt in Western propaganda to blame the debt crisis in Sri Lanka on China, but China only owns 9% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt. The vast majority of Sri Lanka's foreign debt is owed to Western financial institutions, including major corporations and vulture funds like BlackRock, which is now buying up real estate all across the United States. So the reality is that this globe-spanning empire, it's all about extracting wealth so a small handful of oligarchs can make money. And we've seen the same process happen inside the United States itself, not at the same level, but a similar process of more inequality, poverty rising, unemployment rising. And we've seen that at the same time, a small handful of billionaires continue to make more and more wealth. And we see people like Elon Musk, after the coup in Bolivia in 2019, which, unlike the soft coup in Pakistan, fortunately, it wasn't very bloody, although the military did repress people after the coup. They did repress the protests against the coup in Pakistan. But in Bolivia, I myself have been to Bolivia. I've reported on the coup that happened in 2019. That was a military coup that overthrew the democratically elected president, Evo Morales, who, by the way, was the first ever indigenous president in a majority indigenous country in Bolivia. He was also a socialist, and he nationalized the lithium reserves and said that the lithium should belong to the Bolivian people. And then what happened after the coup? The coup regime, backed by the US, it privatized the lithium to sell it off to private corporations. And then Elon Musk, a billionaire oligarch, he said, we will coup whoever we want. So, I mean, that's the thing is, imperialists don't just go around the world for power. It's not just because they want power. It's because they want to make money and become rich and steal natural resources. The reality is that this process of freeing countries in the global South from neocolonialism it's part of that process of understanding that imperialism has always been based on extraction. And that's why these Western colonialist powers, these imperialist powers, are organizing regime change operations and coups and wars. It's part of an attempt to reimpose control over countries in the global South, to take their natural resources, to exploit their labor so they can continue to have a free lunch.
Pakistan is in a slightly more interesting space. And when I say interesting, I use interesting in the context of the Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. We're a nuclear powered state, right? We're 220 million people. Right now, the anti-American sentiment in Pakistan is perhaps at its all-time high. I'd say as close to as 90%. The 60% of the Pakistani population is under 30. They're young people, angry, very angry, prone to violence. There are the Pakistani diaspora outside, living in North America, Canada, the US, the youngsters, extremely angry, very, full of harsh language about what they think has happened in Pakistan, because the vast majority of the diaspora here in North America also supports Imran Khan, and they're against the regime. In that context, I fail to understand why American policymakers don't realize that if one of their primary interests in re-engaging with Pakistan is their security interests in that region, what they're doing right now is so counterproductive that I fear, and I genuinely say, I fear that they may actually be giving birth to not just anger, but something beyond that amongst people who do not understand better.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, this is a trend we see again and again, where these Western imperial powers are very arrogant toward people in the global South and ignore what they have to say. And then it leads to revolution. It leads to violence. I think those are possibilities in Pakistan. But honestly, the coup regime is so unpopular. It's also overseeing a massive economic crisis right now with rising inflation and inequality and poverty. So, I mean, it's a very unstable government. Unfortunately, I think violence is a possibility, but I don't think it's going to withstand even a year. It's going to be pretty unlikely. And the military is not going to be able to unleash an extreme form of violence like it did under Zia-ul-Haq, because it doesn't have the popular support. You can only use violence to try to keep that discontent at a low simmer if only a small percentage of the population is against you. But if almost everyone's against you, you're not going to be able to do that. So I think it's inevitable. It's a matter of time that the coup regime is going to fall. And I think it's very likely that Imran Khan is going to come back to power. Ironically, he's probably going to be more popular when he comes back than he was even when he was in office. And certainly, I know people who support Imran Khan who say that, he did make some mistakes. Every leader makes mistakes. It's so similar to me to see what happened in Latin America. I mean, I mentioned the coup in Bolivia in 2019. So Evo Morales, who was the leftist indigenous president, he won the election and he was overthrown with these fake claims of fraud that the US and the Organization of American States spread. Well, what happened is the coup regime was very violent and it was very heavy-handed, and it oversaw an economic crisis. And 11 months after the coup, in October of 2020, there were elections, and the coup regime tried to delay elections 3 different times. And there were so many protests. And there were also one difference in Bolivia, which is a little different from Pakistan, is there's a very well-organized labor movement in Bolivia with labor unions. And they organized big strikes that paralyzed the country. And the coup regime was forced to have elections after delaying them 3 times. And in October 2020, 11 months after the coup, they were defeated in a landslide. And the very same party of Evo Morales, which is called the Movement Towards Socialism Party, the MAS, they won in a massive landslide. And Evo Morales' economic minister, Luis Arce, came to power. And now he's even more popular than Evo Morales was. So that's a lesson that the US tried to impose this very unpopular, violent coup regime on Bolivia. All it could stand was 11 months, and it was defeated at the ballot box. And now the new government is even more popular.
I also know that Imran is going to be a far better partner to the US than these corrupt military-backed guys, because these guys have no interest for the region, neither for the country. I mean, all their interests, they're kleptocrats, plutocrats, right? So Imran is a Democrat. I think an unstable Pakistan under a military regime or a corrupt plutocratic, kleptocratic setup is far more dangerous for American security interests within mainland US, I'm telling you, than a free democratic Pakistan under a popular leader like Imran with strong institutions, rule of law, freedom of fundamental rights, human rights, and all that goes with it.
I would agree, but there's a history of this. We know, of course, that the United States supported Zia-ul-Haq, one of the most brutally repressive dictators in the history of Pakistan. And we saw that, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who, interestingly, we've seen that Imran Khan has been invoking him, talking about the history of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and the coup against him and how similar it was. He was a very popular leader who was overthrown, and the United States backed a very unpopular dictatorship. We've seen a very similar thing across Latin America and other parts of Africa and Asia. So I mean, this isn't the first time, but I agree with you. I mean, the reality is that Imran Khan, he's not, he's not a revolutionary. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I think actually it would be good to have a revolutionary. I think the world needs a revolution, but he's a very diplomatic, moderate politician. But I think we need to understand that what U.S. policymakers are thinking about right now is not about what's best for Pakistan. They're thinking about their larger geopolitical goals. And I think we can't understand what Washington and also the European Union are doing without keeping in mind that we're in a new Cold War. And just as in the first Cold War that you could say went from 1945 or so until 1991, in that first Cold War, the US backed many dictatorships that were pro-Western and anti-Soviet. Now we see a similar situation, although it's not the Soviet Union, it's China and Russia. And we see that the US and the European Union are backing unpopular, in many cases, authoritarian governments in order to prevent them from allying with China and Russia. The irony is that the current coup regime in Pakistan understands that it cannot break relations with China because China is, in terms of its economy, China is absolutely, it's a mandatory partner. Like Pakistan needs its economic relations with China. But we saw what happened with Russia. I mean, of course, in many cases, it was kind of an unfortunate coincidence that Imran Khan arrived in Russia in his historic meeting with Putin in Moscow on the same day that Russia initiated this, war in Ukraine. It's very unfortunate for Imran Khan. Of course, he didn't know that was going to happen. But it's not a coincidence that Imran Khan, like many countries in the global south, not just Pakistan, India, Indonesia, many countries in Africa, South Africa, many countries in Latin America, they're all maintaining neutrality in the war, the proxy war in Ukraine. But of course, what happened is General Bajwa, after the coup, he blamed Russia. He said he expressed support for Ukraine. And now we see reports that Pakistan is selling ammunition to Ukraine. That's a clear sign that one of the main reasons the U.S. wanted to remove Imran Khan is to prevent Pakistan from improving its relations with Russia, because the U.S. goal right now is to isolate China and Russia and prevent Eurasian integration. And we see this especially in Europe. I mean, we're talking about how the U.S. is doing something bad for Pakistan. Well, we also see that the U.S. is genuinely doing something very bad for Europe. These countries that the U.S. considers to be its top allies. The German economy is being bankrupted right now because Germany imported 66% of its gas from Russia, and then they just cut off that gas. So now there's a massive energy crisis across Europe. Energy bills are skyrocketing. There are entire industries that are going to go bankrupt, especially in Germany, but also in Italy and France. So the reality is that the US is economically causing Europe to suffer. I mean, of course, there are European politicians going along with this willingly in order to try to bleed Russia because they think that they can win this proxy war against Russia. And then after Russia, they want a war on China. And that's why Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, expressing support for separatism in Taiwan. That's why Joe Biden continues to repeat that if there's a conflict over Taiwan, the U.S. is going to militarily intervene, despite the fact that the United States in the 1970s, when it normalized relations with the People's Republic of China and signed the 3 communiques, it agreed to recognize the one China policy, recognizing that Taiwan is part of China. Everything that the U.S. and the West is doing it's not about what's best for the people of Pakistan or any other, or even Europe. It's about weakening China and Russia. And we see this in the U.S. National Defense Strategy, which was published in 2018, in which the Pentagon declared the end to the so-called war on terror, which of course terrorized the people of Pakistan. But that era is technically over, and now we're in the new Cold War. And the Defense Department said that the main opponents of the U.S. are now China and Russia. And then we see that NATO, in this Madrid summit that was held this June, NATO published its 2022 defense strategy, which is called the Strategic Concept. And it said the same thing. It said the main enemy of NATO are China and Russia.
Amazing. Ben, it's always such a pleasure. I'm so grateful I got to listen to you firsthand. I watched you and heard you on the net. Last summary of what you've just said. Give us a number, give us a date. When do you think this neo-colonialism and this global imperialism is going to end? Give us a year.
Well, that's hard. I think in the decades to come, it's going to be not a process that happens overnight. What we're seeing, I think, my analysis is that we're seeing a reemergence of something similar to the non-aligned movement, like we saw in the 1960s and 70s with the Bandung Conference. We saw leaders like Sukarno in Indonesia, like Nehru in India, like we saw in Egypt with Nasser, with Tito in Yugoslavia. They founded and I mentioned Nkrumah in Ghana. Yes. They founded the non-aligned movement in the 1960s. So there was this Cold War happening. They said, we don't want to be part of a Cold War. We're non-aligned. We want to do what's best for our own countries to develop our own countries. I think what we're seeing now is the reemergence of a non-aligned movement to try to build this multipolar world with countries saying that they don't want to be involved in these proxy wars between the US and Russia. They want to pursue their own independent path of development. And we see the majority of countries in the global south, which represent the majority of the global population, they agree with this. They're trying to build a new path of development. And I think organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, they offer an opportunity to help build that new global infrastructure economically and politically. I think Pakistan is already a part of that. It's going to play an important role. Also, as Pakistan continues to grow as a country, with one of the, in the top 5 largest populations, I think, it's going to be a significant part of this process in the decades to come. A lot of these Western powers, they're not going to allow their colonial structures to go without a fight. And unfortunately, the real danger is not only more regime change operations and coups, but is world war. And that's what scares me the most. I think if there's not a World War III, if there's not a nuclear war, I think within the next 100 years or even 50 years, we're going to see the end of that Western hegemony.
Ben, thank you so much. Really wonderful listening to you. I hope we can continue this conversation. I know you're a really busy man, but I'll ping you frequently and see if I can pick your brains another time. Thank you very much, Ben, once again, and have a wonderful day in Nicaragua.